This is the bonus epilogue to Dance of the Dryad by Bianca D'Arc. Copyright 2022 by Bianca D'Arc, all rights reserved. June in Sacramento. Herman Stockton got to walk his adopted daughter down the aisle on her wedding day. His wife, Marilissa, had spent months setting up this event, from booking the church to deciding on the reception venue to picking out the catering and entertainment. They'd spent weeks on fittings for dresses. The bride was in white, of course, but the matron of honor and 5 bridesmaids wore various shades of green with gold accents. Sonny's newfound sister, Sally, was the matron of honor. Her husband, Jason Moore, was one of the groomsmen. In fact, all the bridesmaids had brought their husbands along. Most of the men were in the wedding party, as they were almost all old friends of the groom. Sonny had decided to have the ceremony in her former hometown because that was where most of her non-magical friends were living still. There were many people at the wedding who had no idea that there was magic in the world, but that didn't mean they weren't still friends of Sonny's and her parents. The Stocktons had lived in secret among regular folk almost their entire lives and had many friends in the area. All had been invited to the wedding and reception, which would double as a going-away party of sorts, since they were all moving away from Sacramento. Sonny's parents were putting out the story that they were going to enjoy a bit of traveling now that Sonny was back on her feet and had a new husband who wasn't from the area. They let it be known that he was one of the Redstone family from Las Vegas, and hinted that the happy couple might be moving to that city, though they hadn't quite decided where they would end up yet. Nobody needed to know exactly where they were all headed, so they kept it vague for the most part. That said, many of the guests were magical, and some knew a bit more of the family's plans for the immediate future. In fact, some of those guests had been instrumental in helping Sonny's parents find a place they could live safely and reopen their school of magecraft. There were lots of shifters, a passel of dryads, some others that Herman clocked as powerful though he didn't know and didn't dare ask what they were exactly. Even some of the Stocktons' old students had traveled in to attend the wedding. Herman knew his daughter was already married in the eyes of her new husband's people, but magic users lived more fully in the world of man than most others, so it was good to have the official ceremony and legal documents. And even though Herman and Marilissa were both disrespected members of their families, they had invited their relatives to their daughter's wedding. It was only polite. It was also something of a requirement in the older magical families to report all marriages, so they could be recorded in the family archives. Lineage was important to the old magical families. The church was packed, and Herman had never been prouder than to walk his little girl down the aisle. She was a vision in white. The gown had been designed just for her with white-on-white embroidery of leafy vines and tiny sparkling flowers. She may have come to join his family in a strange way, but once Marilissa had decided to take Sonny in, she had become his daughter in truth. He loved her as his own, and was glad she had finally found a mate worthy of her. He was also happy that she'd finally discovered her own power. Marilissa sat at the front of the church, nervously waiting for Herman to walk Sonny down the aisle. When the music started and she turned to look at the back of the church, she was stunned to see not only her own mother and father, but also Herman's parents sitting together toward the back of the church in a pew with Marilissa's brothers and at least 2 of Herman's sisters. She hadn't seen any of them in years, but they'd all shown up for Sonny's wedding. Marilissa didn't know what to think. Why would they come here now, when they hadn't even sent a Christmas card in the past 30 years? Had they somehow gotten wind of just how magical Herman and Marilissa's daughter really was? Marilissa felt a wave of protectiveness coupled with resentment. If their families thought they could just waltz in after all these years and interfere in any way with Sonny's life, they had better think again. Then she remembered Den. Sonny had a powerful protector in her new mate, and Den had a powerful family behind him as well. Even the combined power of Marilissa and Herman's families wouldn't stand a chance against the Redstone clan. Let them try to interfere with Sonny. They'd be lucky if any of them lived through any such attempt. Taking a deep breath, Marilisa tried to put her parents and Herman's parents out of her mind. This was a moment she had been looking forward to for a very long time. Her little girl was getting married, and she was going to enjoy every last minute of it. She would deal with the families later. Sonny and Herman walked slowly down the aisle, and Marilisa concentrated on them. Sonny was a vision in white, the dress living up to every one of Marilisa's expectations. It sparkled and almost glowed in the shafts of sunlight coming in through the cathedral's high windows. Sonny paused for just a second as she passed her mother's place, leaning in to kiss Marilisa's cheek and whisper, "I love you, Mom." Marilisa teared up even more. "Go get 'em, Sonny," she replied, something she had said to her daughter before every big exam or dance recital since she'd been a little girl. And then they walked on, and Herman handed their little girl off to the man who made her so very happy. Herman left Sonny with a kiss on the cheek and walked back to join Marilisa in the front pew. He took her hand, and they both had eyes sparkling with unshed tears at the beauty and significance of the moment. The ceremony proceeded as Marilisa had planned, and before she knew it, Sonny and Den were walking down the aisle, beaming happily, hand in hand. The ceremony was over, and the time for celebration was almost upon them. There would be a quick break to let the photographer take some photos of the happy couple as the rest of the guests made their way to the reception venue. Marilisa and Herman were supposed to join the newlyweds for the photo session, but she held Herman back as the rest of the church emptied out. Marilisa made eye contact with her mother as the older woman stood her ground in that back pew. The families weren't moving either. Marilisa supposed holy ground was the best place for this sort of confrontation. It had been a long time coming. For a moment she almost laughed, thinking of them all as gunfighters in the OK Corral. "Calm down, honey," Herman said softly to her. "Maybe this is an olive branch. Let's just see what they have to say." Herman, always the calm one in their partnership, made sense as usual. He held her hand and they waited. The family would have to come to them. Besides, there were more people milling around toward the back of the church. If they wanted to have a semi-private conversation, the front of the church was obviously the best place for that. As soon as the aisle cleared, Marilisa's mother led the way toward the front. Everybody else from the families followed behind, making quite the little posse. Marilisa's apprehension grew. She and Herman were terribly outnumbered at the moment. Adriana Washington, Marilisa's mother, stopped precisely 5 feet away. Most of the others filled in behind her, moving into the pews so that everybody could be seen. The Washington matriarch nodded. "You're looking well, Marilisa. And you, Herman. Congratulations on your daughter's wedding. We were pleased to receive your invitation," she said, just as starchly as she always had been, even if there were a few more white hairs among the gold on her head. The matriarch had aged very well. Then again, with the amount of magic she had at her command, that wasn't surprising. "Hello, Mother. You look impeccable as always. Thank you for coming to Sonny's wedding, though I admit I'm surprised to see you here." Marilisa wasn't the pushover she had been at 20 years old, and her mother would soon figure that out. Much to her surprise, the matriarch's expression crumbled. For the first time ever, Marilisa saw raw human emotion on her mother's face. "I'm truly sorry for that, Marilisa. I know I've made mistakes, and one of the biggest of my life has been the way I dealt with you and Herman. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope that we can salvage something and move forward on better terms." Marilisa could hardly believe what she had just heard. Her mother had always had a backbone of steel. Marilisa's father had died right after she had met Herman. Ever since then, her mother had seemed to grow colder and more distant. At a time when Marilisa had wanted to cling to her family, her mother had done nothing but push her away. Herman had been her salvation. His love had brought her through the toughest time in her life, and he had made her happy every day since. Josiah Stockwell stood next to the Washington matriarch. The Stockwells were an old magical family, but not quite as powerful as the Washingtons, which was one of the reasons he had deferred to Adriana, letting her take the lead. The other reason was that he just didn't know what to say to his son, Herman. He had gone along with Adriana when she had decided to disown their disobedient children, but he had his hands full at the time, just keeping his family financially above water. Herman hadn't known about that, of course. None of the children had. Josiah didn't like to complain about what his own parents had done to the family finances. It had been up to him to fix things so that the family line could continue with dignity. He hadn't wanted anybody to know when they had hit rock bottom and were nearly broke. That had happened right around the time Herman had met Marilisa and decided that they just had to be together. Josiah had arranged a marriage with an heiress for Herman, but he would not hear of it. Marilisa was the only girl he wanted, and Josiah couldn't explain why it was so important that he marry a woman of means, not only magically but also financially. Herman's disobedience had angered Josiah so much he had let Adriana convince him to cut ties with his son. Adriana had claimed that if they let the children fall on their faces, they would both eventually come running back to their families. She'd been wrong, so very wrong. Not only had their children made a life for themselves, they had exceeded all expectations. Even Josiah had heard the rumors about the mage school that taught the protective arts. It wasn't exactly something Josiah understood, being a battle mage himself, but he knew the rest of the magical community was very impressed with the students that came out of Herman and Marilisa's little school. Not just the students, but the things they made as well. Such items imbued with magic during their creation were in great demand these days. Dark times meant that everyone wanted a little extra protection around their properties and homes. The sculptures, paintings, and other art and craft work produced by Herman and Marilisa's students provided that. And not just their students. Josiah had come by a painting created by his son several years ago. Josiah had purchased it at auction for a very high price. It hung in his study, a reminder of the son he hadn't seen in years. Its magic also protected the entrance to the family vault. The sad truth was, Josiah just didn't know how to approach his son, not after so much time had passed. The wedding invitation had at last created an opportunity. When Adriana had called him about it, after receiving her own invitation, Josiah had once again colluded with the woman to bring about this long-awaited reunion. "Is that what you want too?" Herman asked Josiah, meeting his gaze for the first time in years. It took Josiah a moment to realize that his son was asking if he agreed with what Adriana had just said. This was too important to let the Washington matriarch speak for him. Josiah took a step toward his son. "I have one of your paintings, Herman. It's titled Water Lily. I bought it at auction, and it hangs in my study. I'm sorry I never saw the value in your abilities until much too late, but I see it now, and I want us to be family again. Someday, if you can find it in your heart to forgive me." The silence dragged on almost too long before Herman stepped forward. He held out his hand and Josiah took it, then tugged his son forward for a hug. "There's nothing to forgive, Dad." "I hope you're all coming to the reception," Marilisa said with a bright smile. Sunny was in seventh heaven dancing with her new husband. They'd had mating parties with both the Wolf Pack in Wyoming and the Redstone Clan in Las Vegas, but this was the kind of wedding Sunny had always dreamed of when she'd been a little girl. Her mother had done most of the planning, but Sunny had enjoyed participating in making choices about the menu and the music and the decorations and the venues. It was a fairy tale sort of setting that brought together all of her old friends from Sacramento with her newfound cousins of the Dryad variety. Every one of her newfound relatives had agreed to be in the wedding party, which thrilled Sunny to no end. She'd always had a very small family, and suddenly she had more relatives than she really knew what to do with. And some of them were blood relatives, which was something she'd never had before. The party would go on for hours, and Sunny was enjoying every moment of it, but when she saw her folks talking to some older people she didn't recognize, she grew curious. She was even more curious when her mother caught her eye and waved her over to the table where all the strangers were seated. Her mother was smiling, so Sunny wasn't worried, but something was definitely odd. She'd seen the seating plan, and this table had been set aside for anyone who decided to come at the last minute, but Sunny didn't know any of the people at the table besides her parents. The mystery was solved almost immediately when Sunny's mother introduced the eldest of the women at the table. "Sunny, this is my mother, Adriana Washington, matriarch of the family." Speechless for a moment, Sunny took the old woman's hand and shook it politely. A little tingle of magic passed between them, something Sunny had learned to recognize in recent months. This woman, the matriarch, had a great deal of power if Sunny was any judge. "I'm pleased to meet you," Sunny told the woman, who didn't look a day over 40, though she was likely quite a bit older. "I know my mother has missed having her family in her life." Sunny's words had a slight edge to them. She wasn't going to just let this woman waltz back into her mother's life when she'd been so mean to the people Sunny loved most in the world for so many years. The matriarch might be powerful, but so was Sunny, and she had a lot of magical friends and family now. She wasn't going to kowtow to anyone, especially not someone who had hurt her parents. Marilisa and Herman were the gentlest souls Sunny knew. They had opened their home and their hearts to her, and she couldn't have wished for better examples by which to live her life. That this so-called matriarch hadn't seen her own daughter's value was a crime. But the woman just smiled. "I'm glad to finally meet you, Sunny. I've seen you dance many times, and always thought you had a real gift. In fact, your farewell performance was magnificent." Sunny hadn't expected that. Had this woman realized who Sunny was all along? Or had that knowledge only come later? Had the matriarch been secretly keeping tabs on her daughter and her family all these years? "It might have been nice to know you were there back when I was performing, and who you were," Sunny said, allowing a bit of her emotions to show in her words and tone. "I know, dear. As I've told Marilisa, I freely acknowledge that I've made many mistakes. Forbidding Marilisa to marry Herman was probably the biggest." The older woman sighed. "And going along with that plan was mine," an older man said, seated next to the matriarch. "I'm your grandfather Stockwell," he explained, introducing himself. "Stockwell?" Sunny asked, a bit confused as Den joined her at the side of the table. He stood behind and just to one side of her, literally backing her up in case she needed him. He was such a great guy. "When our families disowned us, we decided to make our own way," Herman explained. "We took the stock from Stockwell and the ton from Washington and made up our own name. That's how we became Stocktons." "You started out with nothing and have built a respectable school of your own," Josiah said quietly. "You and Marilisa did more to advance the craft than any of your generation, which is what finally made me realize I'd been wrong. But by then, you were established, and it was nigh on impossible to go back and make amends. When I received the invitation to Sunny's wedding, I knew I couldn't put this off any longer. There would never be a better opportunity to tell you both how proud I've been of what you've accomplished." "That means a lot, Dad," Herman replied with quiet dignity. Sunny looked at her parents and the people around the table and came to a decision. "I'm glad my wedding is the occasion that could begin to heal the rift in our families. If that's what comes out of this, I'll be very happy." An hour later, Sunny and Den were dancing again, surrounded by their friends and so much family. Sunny wanted to pinch herself to be sure she wasn't dreaming. She'd come so far in such a short time, it all seemed a little unreal. Den leaned down to nuzzle her cheek. "Penny for your thoughts," he whispered near her ear. "I'm thinking how blessed I am to have all this. You, my new family, my old family, and all the rest of it. I was just thanking the divine for all the great things in my life, but most especially," she kissed his cheek tenderly, "for you, Den. I love you more than I can say." He stopped dancing and tightened their embrace, looking down into her eyes. "I love you too, Sonny. You are my world." Then he kissed her in front of everyone as if they were alone. A wolf whistle broke them apart a few moments later, and Sonny knew her face was hot with a blush, but she would never be embarrassed about the love she shared with her shifter mate. They were the real thing, the forever love she had dreamed about but never really expected to find. There might be trials to come and maybe tough times ahead, but one thing she knew for certain: they were a team now, 2 hearts beating as one, 2 souls traveling this life's road together. Whatever may come, they would face it together. You've been listening to the bonus epilogue from Dance of the Dryad. The next book in the series is called Night of the Nymph. It is currently available in ebook and print formats. Look for it wherever books are sold. For more information, visit www.biancadarc.com. And please don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can bring you more of this great content. Happy reading!